The cabin that shouldn't have had power. Rain had been falling for so many hours that I could no longer remember what clear skies looked like. The windshield wipers swept across the glass in a steady rhythm, fighting a battle they were never going to win. Every few seconds the road disappeared behind another sheet of rain, leaving only the narrow tunnel of light stretching out from my headlights. I had left Portland late that afternoon, expecting to reach a small town before nightfall. It was supposed to be an easy drive through western Oregon, one I'd made before years ago. Back then, these roads had felt peaceful. Tonight, they felt forgotten. Somewhere along the way, my GPS froze. A few minutes later, my phone lost its signal. I wasn't concerned at first. Dead zones weren't unusual out here. I figured I'd eventually find another highway or a town where I could stop for the night, but the miles kept passing. The road became narrower, the trees grew taller, and every sign of civilization slowly disappeared behind me. No gas stations, no diners, no headlights approaching from the opposite direction. Nothing. Only endless rain and the dark silhouettes of pine trees standing silently on both sides of the road. The truck's old radio crackled with bursts of static every now and then. I reached over several times, turning the tuning dial in search of anything. A weather report, late-night music, even an advertisement.
I should have stayed in the truck.
Every station answered with the same lifeless hiss. Eventually, I stopped trying. The silence inside the cab somehow felt heavier than the static itself. There are moments in life when you realize you've crossed an invisible line. You don't know exactly when it happened. You don't even notice it at first. But later, when you look back, you understand that everything after that moment was unavoidable. I crossed mine somewhere on that road. Rain continued pounding against the windshield as the forest seemed to close in around me. The beams of my headlights reached only a short distance before disappearing into thick mist. It felt as though the darkness was swallowing the road faster than I could drive through it. Something appeared between the trees. At first, I assumed it was another shadow created by the rain. But as I got closer, the shape remained. I slowed the truck. The headlights illuminated the outline of an old wooden cabin sitting just beyond the roadside. Its roof sagged beneath years of weather. The porch leaned slightly to one side. Several windows were boarded shut. The rest reflected nothing but darkness. It looked abandoned. Not recently abandoned, forgotten, like a place that had quietly slipped out of the world without anyone noticing. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and stared at it for several long seconds. Common sense told me to keep driving. But common sense has never been very persuasive when you're alone, exhausted, and running out of options. The rain wasn't letting up. My fuel gauge was dropping lower than I liked. And I hadn't seen another building in nearly an hour. If someone still lived there, maybe they could point me toward the nearest town. If no one did, at least the porch would keep me out of the rain for a while. I shifted the truck into park, turned off the engine, and listened. The sudden silence felt unnatural. The rain continued outside, but somehow everything else had stopped. Looking back now, I should have started the engine again. I should have driven away. Instead, I reached for my flashlight. The rain greeted me the instant I opened the truck door. A cold gust of wind swept through the cab, carrying the scent of wet pine, soaked earth, and old timber. Within seconds, tiny drops of rain covered my jacket and the flashlight in my hand. I stepped onto the muddy shoulder of the road and closed the truck door behind me. The sound echoed farther than it should have. For a brief moment, I stood perfectly still. The engine was gone. The radio was silent. Only the storm remained. The cabin stood no more than 30 feet away. Yet somehow, it felt much farther than that. Its weathered porch leaned slightly to one side. The wooden railing had nearly collapsed. Moss climbed the support posts. Weeds pushed through the cracks beneath the steps. Nature had been patiently reclaiming the place for years. No lights glowed behind the windows. No smoke rose from the chimney. No footprints disturbed the mud leading to the front door. Everything about the cabin suggested no one had lived there for a very long time. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. Every sensible part of me whispered the same advice. Get back in the truck, keep driving, find somewhere else. But storms have a way of making bad decisions sound reasonable. The rain was growing heavier by the minute. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, even if I turned around now. I wasn't sure how much farther I could safely drive. I convinced myself I only needed a few minutes. If the cabin was empty, I could wait for the rain to ease. If someone still lived there, perhaps they could tell me where the nearest town was. That simple thought was enough to keep me moving. The mud clung to my boots as I crossed the small clearing. Each step sank slightly into the saturated ground. The forest around me remained strangely quiet. No owls, no insects, not even the sound of branches rubbing together in the wind. It wasn't the silence of an empty forest. It was the silence of a place that seemed to be listening. I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. The flashlight beam climbed slowly across the old wooden boards. Rainwater dripped steadily from the roof every few seconds. A single drop struck the porch with a sharp, hollow tap. The front door stood slightly open, not wide enough to welcome anyone, just enough to make me wonder who had left it that way. I called out, "Hello." My voice disappeared into the darkness. No answer. I waited. Still nothing. Taking a slow breath, I climbed the steps. Each board groaned beneath my weight. The sound echoed through the empty night. I reached the doorway. The air inside felt colder. Not the kind of cold that comes from rain. A deeper cold, the kind that settles into your bones. I pushed the door open with one hand. The hinges let out a long, tired groan. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room. An old wooden table, two broken chairs, a stone fireplace filled with cold ashes. Everything was buried beneath years of dust. Everything except the floor near the entrance. Something had disturbed the dust, not footprints. Long, narrow marks, as though something heavy had been dragged slowly across the floor. The trail disappeared into the darkness beyond the hallway. I remained perfectly still. My flashlight stayed fixed on the marks for several long seconds. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old enough to disappear beneath the dust either. Someone, or something, had moved through this room. Not very long ago. I listened carefully. The rain continued outside. The wind brushed softly against the walls. Then, a sound, very faint, somewhere deeper inside the cabin. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a footstep. It sounded more like wood settling beneath a slow, unseen weight. I told myself the cabin was old. Old houses always made noises. That explanation should have been enough, but it wasn't. The hallway beyond the living room seemed darker than the rest of the cabin. My flashlight reached only a few feet before the darkness swallowed the beam. For the first time that night, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Fear. Real fear. Not because I had seen anything, but because every instinct I had was telling me to leave immediately. But I didn't move. Not yet. Walking away would have been the sensible choice. No abandoned cabin was worth this feeling. No broken-down shelter deserved another second of my curiosity. Still, I couldn't ignore the sound. It had been too deliberate, too heavy to blame on the wind. I drew one slow breath and tightened my grip on the flashlight. The beam shook only slightly, enough for me to notice. Enough to admit my hands were no longer completely steady. The hallway waited in perfect silence. One careful step, then another. The old floor groaned beneath my boots. Each creak seemed to travel farther than it should have. The air felt colder here, not freezing, just strangely empty. The smell of wet wood slowly disappeared. In its place came the dry scent of old paper and forgotten rooms. Halfway down the hallway, I stopped. Every doorway ahead stood partly open, all except one. A single door remained completely closed. Its faded paint was scarred around the handle. Not random scratches, long marks, deep, almost parallel. As if someone had clawed at the wood, trying to keep it shut, or trying to escape. I stood there without breathing, listening. Nothing. Only the rain outside. Only the wind brushing softly against the roof. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Animals, rotting wood, an old cabin settling into the mountain. But the silence beyond that door felt different. Not empty, occupied. I slowly raised my hand. My fingers stopped only inches from the handle. Then, from the other side, a single, soft tap. I froze. My hand remained suspended in the air. The tiny sound had been so soft, yet impossibly clear. Not the creak of old timber. Not a branch striking the wall. It had come from the other side of the door. I waited. 1 second, then 5, then 10. Nothing. The silence settled over the hallway once again, slowly, carefully. I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal handle. It felt damp, almost as if someone had touched it moments before. I swallowed and turned it. The latch released without resistance. No loud squeak, no sudden crash, only a quiet click. The door drifted inward by a few inches. A deeper darkness waited beyond. My flashlight reached inside. At first, I saw almost nothing, bare wooden walls. A narrow window covered by thick dust, an old rocking chair resting in the corner. It moved ever so slightly, back, then forward, back, then still. I stared at it, trying to convince myself the movement had been caused by the draft. The window had to be broken somewhere. There had to be a current of air. That was the only explanation that made sense. Then my light dropped to the floor. Fresh dust covered the room, undisturbed, except for one narrow trail. A line where the dust had been brushed aside. It began beside the rocking chair, and continued slowly across the floor. Toward the open door, toward my feet. I couldn't move. The beam of my flashlight stayed fixed on the floor. That thin trail through the dust ended less than a foot from my boots. Nothing stood there, nothing that I could see. I forced myself to breathe, slowly, quietly. Then I followed the trail back across the room. It was too narrow for footprints, too smooth to have been left by an animal. It looked as though something heavy had been dragged. Without leaving a single mark beside it, the line ended beneath the rocking chair. I lowered the flashlight. The chair was old. Its wood had faded almost gray with age. One armrest was cracked. The seat was covered with a thin layer of dust, untouched, except for a small circle near the center, a clean spot, bare wood. As though someone had been sitting there not long ago. A cold pressure settled across my shoulders. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Even the sound of the rain seemed farther away. I took one careful step backward. The floor answered with a soft creak. Then, the rocking chair moved again. Once, forward, then back. Very slowly. This time, there was no breeze, no broken window. Nothing I could blame. I kept staring at the chair. It continued to rock, gentle, steady, like someone had just stood up, only seconds before I walked in. I couldn't take my eyes off the chair. It moved only once more, a slow, gentle rock. Then it stopped. The room became perfectly still. I listened for another sound. Nothing. Even the rain seemed distant now. I stepped closer. Every instinct warned me not to, but curiosity had carried me this far. The old chair stood in the center of the room. Its wood was worn smooth with age. One of the runners had been repaired long ago with rough iron nails. Someone had cared enough to keep using it, for years, maybe longer. I swept the flashlight across the walls. They were almost bare. No paintings, no shelves. No furniture except the chair. Then the beam caught something near the far corner. A small wooden table. Dust covered nearly every inch of it. Except for one object, a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked, its edges had darkened with time. But unlike everything else in the room, very little dust had settled on it. As though it hadn't been sitting there for decades. as though someone had touched it recently. I stared at the journal for several long seconds. The cabin remained silent. The chair no longer moved. Slowly, I reached toward the table, the moment my fingers brushed the worn leather cover. A loud thud echoed somewhere deep beneath the floor. I jerked my hand away. The journal slipped from my fingers before I had even touched it. The sound had been impossible to ignore. A single heavy thud, deep below the cabin. It wasn't above me. It wasn't outside. It came from somewhere underneath the floorboards. I held my breath, waiting. The silence returned. Slowly, I lowered myself to one knee. My flashlight swept across the wooden planks. The old boards were uneven. Some had warped with age. Others were stained by years of rain and damp air. Then I noticed something strange. Near the center of the room, one section of the floor looked newer. The wood wasn't fresh, but it didn't match the rest. Different grain, different color. Someone had replaced those boards, not recently, but long after the cabin had first been built. I reached out and pressed my palm against them, cold, far colder than the surrounding floor. Then, another sound, not a thud this time. A long, slow, scraping noise, as though something was moving beneath the cabin, not quickly, not violently, just dragging itself through the darkness below. The sound lasted only a few seconds. Then it stopped. I remained completely still. My heartbeat filled the silence for one impossible moment. It almost sounded as though something underneath me was listening to. I stayed exactly where I was. Every muscle in my body had locked in place. The silence beneath the floor lasted so long that I began to question what I had heard. Maybe exhaustion was finally catching up with me. Maybe the storm, the long drive, the empty cabin were playing tricks on my mind. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. Slowly, I stood and picked up the journal. The leather felt dry and brittle beneath my fingers. Its pages had yellowed with age. The first few were blank. Then I found writing, small, neat, carefully written by hand. The ink had faded, but it was still readable. The first entry wasn't a warning. It wasn't a confession. It was a date. October 14th, 1968. Beneath it, only one sentence. I should have left when the knocking first began. I read the line again. My mouth had gone dry. Without thinking, I turned to the next page. Before I could read another word, 3 slow knocks echoed through the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. Not beneath the floor, not behind the door. This time, they came from the front entrance. Someone, or something, was outside, waiting. I didn't move. The journal remained open in my hands. 3 knocks, slow, evenly spaced. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't knocked again. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. I turned off my flashlight. The room disappeared into darkness. For a few seconds, I simply listened. Rain struck the roof in steady waves. Wind whispered through the trees beyond the cabin. Nothing else. I switched the light back on and closed the journal. If someone was outside, I needed to know. Keeping my steps as quiet as possible, I left the small room and entered the hallway. Every board beneath my boots seemed louder now. The living room appeared exactly as I had left it. The cold fireplace, the broken chair, the lantern resting on the old table. Nothing had changed. Yet the cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied. I stopped several feet from the front door. The rain drummed against the weathered wood. Water slipped beneath the frame and disappeared into the cracks of the floor. I reached toward the lock, then hesitated. Who knocks on an isolated cabin in the middle of a mountain storm? Without saying a single word, no voice called out. No footsteps circled the porch. Only silence. Very slowly, I leaned forward, until when I reached the narrow gap beside the curtain, outside. The porch was empty. No person, no animal, nothing. Only the rain. Then, a fresh set of footprints caught my eye. Dark, wet, leading across the porch. Toward the front door, but none, leading away. The footprints ended at the front door. I stared at them for several long seconds. Rain continued to fall across the porch, slowly, steadily. Yet the prints remained clearly visible. As if they had been made only moments ago, I unlocked the door. For an instant, I considered opening it, just enough to look outside. Just enough to convince myself there was nothing there. Instead, I rested my hand against the weathered wood. It was cold, far colder than it should have been. Then, 3 gentle knocks, again, this time, only inches from my hand. I pulled away immediately. Every hair on my arm stood up. Whoever was outside knew exactly where I was standing. Still, no voice, no request for help, no sound except the rain. I forced myself to look through the narrow gap beside the curtain once more. The porch was still empty, the footprints were still there, dark, wet, perfectly clear. Then, one of them changed, not quickly, not all at once. The water inside the print slowly disappeared. As if an invisible foot had just lifted away from the porch, another print faded, then another, one by one, the trail vanished. Not because the rain had washed it away, but because something unseen was quietly walking back into the darkness. I never opened the door, not that night. I backed away one slow step at a time. The knocking never came again. But neither did the feeling that I was alone. I returned to the living room without taking my eyes off the entrance. The fire remained cold. The lantern burned with the same weak glow. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Except the journal was no longer in my hands. I stopped, certain that I had carried it out of the small room. Certain that I had never put it down. Yet it was gone. I searched every corner of the cabin, the hallway, the empty bedroom. The rocking chair, nothing. It had simply disappeared. A few minutes later, the storm finally began to fade. The first pale light of morning slid through the dirty windows for the first time in hours. The cabin looked ordinary, old, forgotten, almost harmless. I walked outside without looking back. The porch was empty. The footprints were gone. By noon, I had reached the nearest town. When I asked an elderly waitress about the cabin on the mountain, she became strangely quiet. Then she asked me one question. Did you hear the knocking? I never answered. I paid for my coffee, got back into my truck, and drove away. I've never returned to that mountain. But whenever rain falls late at night, I still wake sometimes, certain that somewhere beyond the darkness, someone is patiently waiting to knock again.